The winter of 1884 did not ease into Blackthorn Ridge. It arrived like a fist. Elias Ward stood on the platform of the Northern Pacific Depot with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he did not look at the woman stepping off the train so much as he looked through her. The way a man looks at a mistake he has already decided to correct. Clara Whitaker had barely found her footing on the ice-slicked boards when he spoke, loud enough for the dozen or so townspeople gathered nearby to hear every word. "You're not what was described to me." Clara stopped. Her suitcase, battered brown leather held shut by a length of rope, knocked against her knee. "Excuse me?" "Your letters." He pulled a folded envelope from his coat and held it between two fingers, the way you'd hold something soiled. "They didn't mention your mother's people." The people on the platform went quiet, in the way crowds go quiet when they smell blood. A woman near the depot door whispered something to the man beside her. A child stared openly until his mother pulled him close and turned him away, as if looking too long might be contagious. Clara did not move. "My mother's people," she repeated slowly, "are her business and mine." Elias Ward dropped the envelope at her feet. It landed in a thin skim of snow and sat there like a verdict. "Find your own way back," he said. "I don't want trouble in my house." He walked away without another word. The crowd parted for him easily. No one met Clara's eyes. No one bent to pick up the envelope. They simply turned, one by one, and followed him. And within 2 minutes, the platform was empty except for Clara and the sound of the train disappearing into the white nothing to the west. If you've ever stood somewhere and felt the exact moment the door closed, you know what Clara felt standing on that platform. You know that particular cold, the kind that has nothing to do with weather. If that were you, what would you have done? This is the story of a woman who didn't run, a man who had stopped believing in much of anything, and a little girl who asked the only question that mattered. Stay with me to the end, and if you're new here, this channel is where we tell the stories that don't always get told. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because this one is worth the distance. Clara stood on the platform for a long time after the last person left. She was 31 years old. She had crossed 4 states and spent the last of her savings on a train ticket because a letter, 3 pages, careful handwriting, signed by Elias Ward of Blackthorn Ridge, Montana Territory, had told her there was a place for her here, that he was a man of practical nature and no prejudice, that he needed a woman capable of hard work, and that he did not put much stock in gossip or appearances. She had read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She picked the envelope up off the ground now, not because she needed it, but because leaving it there felt wrong. She tucked it into her coat pocket and looked out at the main street of Blackthorn Ridge, which was nothing more than a packed dirt road lined on both sides with wooden storefronts and one 2-story hotel that had the word Imperial painted above the door in letters that had been grand once and were now just faded. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it in the way the cold stopped being something outside her coat and started being something inside it. She picked up her suitcase. She had no plan. She had maybe $4 left in a list of skills. She could cook, she could sew, she could keep accounts. She had spent 2 years nursing an elderly woman back in Ohio and had learned more about medicine and fever management than most people her age. And none of those skills were going to matter if she couldn't get out of this cold. She walked toward the hotel. The woman behind the desk looked up when Clara pushed through the door, and there was a brief moment, just a flicker, of something almost welcoming in her face before something else replaced it. Clara had seen that replacement happen before. She had spent her whole life watching it happen and had never quite gotten used to it. "I need a room," Clara said. "Just for tonight. I can pay." "We're full," the woman said. Clara looked around the empty lobby. A cat was sleeping on a chair near the window. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner. There was no sound of anyone else in the building. "I see," Clara said. "Sorry." The woman didn't sound sorry. She sounded tired, which was a different thing. Clara walked back out into the cold. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment, letting herself feel the full weight of where she was, which was nowhere. She had made a decision 3 weeks ago that she had believed, truly believed, was going to change the direction of her life. She had let herself imagine a kitchen. She had let herself imagine a bed that was hers. She had let herself imagine, just briefly, something that might eventually become a family. Now she was standing on a boardwalk in Montana with $4 and a coat that wasn't quite warm enough and absolutely no idea what to do next. She was not going to cry. She had made a policy about that years ago, after a specific afternoon in a specific house in Cincinnati, when she had cried in front of people who took her tears as confirmation of everything they already believed about her. She had not cried in public since. She was not going to start now. She walked back to the depot platform, because it was the only place she knew, and she sat down on the bench and put her suitcase between her feet and folded her hands in her lap and thought. The wind came off the mountains in long, flat gusts that pushed right through the boards of the platform shelter. She watched a piece of newspaper cartwheel down the empty street. She watched a horse tied outside the general store shift its weight and blow steam from its nostrils. She watched the sky, which was the color of old pewter, and she tried to remember why she had thought this was a good idea. It hadn't been optimism, exactly. She knew better than optimism. It had been math. The situation in Ohio had stopped being tenable. The family she'd been working for had sold the house and moved east, and the small room she'd rented in town had become unaffordable when her wages stopped. And the advertisement she'd answered in the back pages of a Cincinnati newspaper had offered something she didn't have. A way forward. A door that appeared to be open. She had walked through it. The door had turned out to be painted on a wall. "You're cold." Clara turned. A girl was standing at the edge of the platform. 7 years old, maybe 8, with dark braided hair escaping from under a wool hat and a serious expression that seemed too old for her face. She was wearing a heavy coat that was slightly too big for her and boots that had been resoled at least twice. "A little," Clara said. "You've been sitting here for a while." The girl said this as a statement, not a question. "I watched from across the street." "Did you?" "My father says it's rude to stare, but I wasn't staring." She paused, considering. "I was observing." Despite everything, something shifted in Clara's chest. "That's an important distinction." "I thought so." The girl came a few steps closer. Her eyes were dark brown, direct, and she looked at Clara without any of the replacement that Clara had seen in the hotel woman's face. She just looked. "I saw what Mr. Ward did, on the platform earlier." Clara was quiet. "He does things like that," the girl said, her voice carrying a matter-of-fact weight that made the words worse somehow than if they'd been said with heat. "He thinks he's important. He's not very nice." "No," Clara agreed. "He's not." The girl stood there for a moment, and then she said, "Are you someone who needs a family, like me?" Clara looked at her. She didn't know what she had expected the girl to say, but it hadn't been that. The question was so plain, so without decoration, that it took a moment to settle. Clara felt it the way you feel something that hits a bruise you'd forgotten you had. "What makes you ask that?" she said carefully. "Because you look like how I feel sometimes." The girl shrugged, as if this were obvious. "And because you have nowhere to go. I could tell from watching." Before Clara could answer, she heard footsteps on the platform boards. Heavy, deliberate, the sound of a man who covered ground without wasting energy. She looked up. He was taller than she'd expected from a man whose daughter was so small. Broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a beard that hadn't been trimmed in a while. He was wearing a sheepskin coat that had seen genuine use and boots that were genuine mud, not for show. He stopped about 6 feet away and looked at his daughter first, then at Clara. "Lily." His voice was low, not harsh, but not soft either. "I told you to stay by the wagon." "I know," Lily said, but she was sitting alone. "Lily." "Papa." The girl looked at him steadily. "She has nowhere to go." The man, and something about him made Clara think he was probably younger than he looked, let out a breath through his nose and looked at Clara directly. His eyes were gray-green, the color of sage in winter, and they moved over her the way a practical person takes inventory. Not unkindly, but not gently either, just thoroughly. "Caleb Mercer," he said. "Clara Whitaker." A pause. "You came in on the noon train?" "I did. And Ward left you here." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered it anyway. "He did." Caleb Mercer looked at her for another long moment, and Clara could see him thinking. She could see the calculation happening. Not cold calculation. Not selfish calculation, but the kind a man does when he's adding up a situation against the reality of what he's equipped to handle. "It's going to be below zero tonight," he said finally. "I'm aware." "The hotel won't take you." "They told me they were full." Something moved across his face. Not quite disgust, not quite anger. Something quieter than both. "There's a bunkhouse on my property. It's not much. It's where my two hands stay in summer, and it's been empty since October." He paused. "It has a stove." Clara looked at him carefully. She had been in this world long enough to know that a man offering shelter could mean many different things, and that not all of them were as simple as they sounded. She was trying to read him the way she'd learned to read people quickly. "I can pay," she said. "I'm not asking for payment." "I know you're not. I'm telling you I can. I have some money and I have skills. I'm not looking for charity." He absorbed this without any visible reaction. "All right. And I'd want it understood clearly what this arrangement is." "Understood," he said. "A roof. Nothing more than that." She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why. She had believed people before who turned out not to deserve it. But something about the way he said it, flat and without embellishment, made her think he meant it the way he said it. She picked up her suitcase. Lily fell into step beside her immediately, reaching up without preamble to take Clara's free hand as if they'd done it 100 times. Clara looked down at her. Lily looked up. "My mother died," she said plainly. 3 years ago. Papa doesn't talk about it much." "Lily," Caleb said from behind them, quiet and tired. "She should know," Lily said simply, and kept walking. The Mercer Ranch was 7 miles outside of Blackthorn Ridge, and the drive out took nearly an hour in the wagon, with the wind cutting across the open flats. Clara sat on the bench beside Caleb because Lily had wedged herself firmly between them before anyone could argue about it. The girl talked for most of the drive. Not nervous chatter, but the purposeful monologue of a child who had spent a lot of time with adults who didn't talk much. She told Clara about the ranch, about the 2 horses by name, about a coyote that had been getting into the chicken coop, about a book she was reading that she thought was the best book she'd ever read, but that she was only on page 43, so she couldn't be sure yet. Caleb drove. He didn't talk, but he wasn't unfriendly in his silence. He was just quiet, in the way certain people are quiet. Not closed off, just accustomed to not filling space with noise for the sake of it. Clara sat between them and let the girl's voice wash over her and tried to get her bearings. She was in Montana. She had $4 and a suitcase. The man who had brought her here was a stranger. She had nowhere else to go. These were the facts. But she was not on the platform anymore. The ranch came into view as the wagon crested a low rise, a main house, 2 outbuildings, a barn, all of it sitting in a hollow that offered some protection from the wind. Everything was functional and nothing was decorative. A working ranch, not a display. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the barn, and Clara climbed down before he could offer a hand, which made Lily look at her with open approval. "I'll show you the bunkhouse," Lily announced, taking Clara's suitcase handle before Clara could object. "That's heavy," Clara said. "I'm stronger than I look." Lily was already pulling it across the yard. Caleb watched his daughter drag the suitcase with both hands and said nothing. He started unhitching the horses. Clara watched him for a moment, the practiced efficiency of it, the way he worked without looking, hands knowing where to go without direction. And then she followed Lily. The bunkhouse was small. 2 cots, a table, a pot-bellied stove, a single window with shutters that were frozen mostly closed. Lily had already located the wood box and was attempting to load the stove. "Let me do that," Clara said. "I know how," Lily said. "Papa taught me." "I can see you know how. I'm just offering." A brief negotiation happened in Lily's expression. "You can do the kindling," she said finally, in a tone that suggested this was a significant concession. Clara sat on the edge of the cot and began splitting kindling from the wood beside the door. The knife was dull, and the pine was stubborn, and her fingers were stiff from cold, and it was not easy, and it took longer than it should have. By the time she had a useful pile, Lily had the stove loaded and was waiting with an expression of professional patience. "The flue sticks," Lily informed her as Clara set the kindling. "Good to know. You have to push it and then pull it at the same time. Papa figured it out." Clara tried it. The flue released on the 3rd attempt. She lit the kindling and they both watched the fire catch. The room began, very slowly, to change temperature. Lily sat on the other cot, watching the fire. After a moment she said, "Do you know how to make biscuits?" "I do."
Papa's biscuits are like rocks. She said this without cruelty, just as information. Mrs. Hewitt from the neighboring ranch used to bring some sometimes, but she moved away.
I'll see what ingredients there are, Clara said. I can't promise anything tonight. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied with this reasonable answer. Then she said, Are you going to stay? Clara looked at the fire. The honest answer was that she didn't know. The honest answer was that she didn't have much choice in the short term and plenty of hard questions to answer in the long term. The honest answer was complicated. For now, she said.
Lily seemed to weigh this. I think you should stay longer than now, she said, but I also think that's your decision. It is, Clara agreed. I'm not trying to push you. I know. I just think… Lily stopped. She pulled at a loose thread on the knee of her pants. I think you're not as scared as you look, and I think that matters. Clara looked at the girl. There was something disarming about this child. Not the questions she asked, but the directness with which she asked them, the absence of any social performance. Lily said what she thought and then waited to see what you did with it. Your father, Clara said carefully. He's kind to you? Lily looked mildly offended. He's my papa. I know. I'm asking anyway. Lily's expression shifted to something more thoughtful. He doesn't talk much. He worries a lot and he doesn't always say so. He works all the time because he doesn't know what else to do when he's sad. She picked at the thread again. But he's never mean to me. He's trying. I think he's just not very good at things that aren't the ranch yet. It was the most honest and accurate child's description of grief Clara had ever heard, delivered in the matter-of-fact voice of someone who had simply observed what was true. He sounds like someone doing his best, Clara said. Most people are, said Lily. They're just not very good at it. Caleb did not come to the bunkhouse that evening, which Clara had expected but was glad of anyway. He left a wrapped bundle outside the door. Some bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a small jar of preserved peaches that must have been from autumn, and she heard his boots on the frozen ground going back toward the main house, and then nothing. She ate sitting on the cot with her coat still half on and the fire warming the room to something almost tolerable. She tried to organize her thoughts the way she'd learned to do in genuinely bad situations. Strip out the emotion first, look at the facts, find the next step, only the next step, not all the steps. Fact: she was housed for the night. Fact: she had food. Fact: she was not at this moment in danger. Fact: she did not know what tomorrow looked like. The last fact was the hardest one. She had a talent for making do, but making do required something to work with, and she was not sure yet what was available to work with here. She knew nothing about this ranch except what Lily had told her on the wagon ride, which was considerable information, but not the kind that answered the immediate question of what her role here could possibly be that would justify staying. She was turning this over when she heard a knock, not on the bunkhouse door, but something light and quick. She opened the door and found Lily standing in the dark with a lantern and a book. Papa doesn't know I'm here, Lily said immediately, in a tone that suggested this fact should be kept between them. Lily, I thought maybe you'd want company. The girl lifted the book. I could read aloud. I'm a good reader. Clara looked out into the dark yard. The main house was a lit square against the night. She could see a figure move past a window. Caleb, probably. She looked at the girl in the lantern light, her braids coming loose now from the long day, her face serious and hopeful in equal measure. She stepped back from the door. Come in then, but not long. Lily came in and settled on the other cot with her lantern and her book and read aloud in a clear, practiced voice that suggested she'd done this before. Maybe for herself, maybe for her father, maybe for both. It was a novel, an adventure story, the kind with ships and storms and narrow escapes from things that ought to be inescapable. Clara listened and watched the fire and let herself, just for a little while, not think about tomorrow. She was not someone who let herself be taken care of easily. She had learned early that depending on people was a way of setting yourself up for the exact kind of afternoon she'd had today. But there was something about sitting in a cold room that was becoming warmer by degrees, listening to a child read about the sea, that she hadn't expected to feel like safety. It felt like something she might break if she held it too tight. The knock on the bunkhouse door came around 8 o'clock. Lily's voice stopped mid-sentence. They both looked at the door.
Lily, Caleb's voice from outside. Not angry, just flat with the particular flatness of a parent who isn't angry yet, but is conserving options. Lily looked at Clara. Clara raised her eyebrows and said nothing. Lily called, "I'm coming," and gathered her book and her lantern and went to the door. She opened it and faced her father, who was standing in the cold with no hat on, his breath clouding in the lantern light. "Bed," he said. "I was reading to her." "I know what you were doing." He looked past Lily at Clara for a moment. Not accusingly, more the way someone checks to make sure a situation is what they think it is. "Good night, Miss Whitaker." "Good night," Clara said. Lily looked back at her over her shoulder as her father guided her away by the top of her head. Not rough, just steering. The girl mouthed something that Clara thought was probably tomorrow, and then they were gone. Clara sat down on the cot and listened to their footsteps cross the yard. She picked up the jar of peaches and held it and felt the cold seeping back in from the walls where the fire hadn't reached yet. She was not safe. Not really. Not in any lasting sense. A man she didn't know had given her a roof for a night, and there was nothing to guarantee the night after that, or the one after that. The town that had turned its back on her was 7 miles away and full of people who had already decided what she was worth. The man who had brought her here was kind, probably, in the way some people are kind out of decency rather than warmth. And decency was not permanence. She knew all of this. But the child had come in the dark to read her a story about ships that didn't sink. And Caleb Mercer had knocked on the door to collect his daughter and said goodnight, and the way he said it wasn't dismissive. It was just contained, and contained was different from cruel. Clara had spent a long time among people who were cruel, and people who were merely indifferent, and people who were kind until it cost them something. She was trying to read this man, and she couldn't, not yet, not in one day. But he had not left her on the platform. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole difference. She set the peaches down and leaned back on the cot and looked at the low ceiling and listened to the wind work itself into a fury against the walls of the bunkhouse. And she thought, one more day. That was the deal she'd always made with herself in hard situations. Not forever. Not some large, indefinite commitment. Just one more day. She could manage one more day. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have guessed, lying on that cot in a stranger's bunkhouse, with the wind howling outside and the fire burning down slow and steady, was that one more day was going to turn into a winter, and the winter was going to turn into something neither she nor Caleb Mercer had looked for, or planned for, or known how to want. And long before that happened, things were going to get considerably worse, because Elias Ward was not finished with Clara Whitaker. He hadn't left her on the platform because he'd stopped thinking about her. He'd left her there because he wanted her to have no options. A woman with no options was easier to control, and Elias Ward had spent the better part of 20 years in Blackthorn Ridge, making sure that people who threatened his version of how things ought to be stayed either beneath him or disappeared entirely. Claire had done something on that platform that he hadn't expected. She hadn't left. And that, in Elias Ward's experience, was the beginning of a problem. He was going to make sure it didn't become a bigger one. What he had not counted on, what no one in Blackthorn Ridge had counted on, was Caleb Mercer deciding that this time, unlike the last time something that mattered was threatened, he was not going to look the other way. The morning came in gray and mean, the kind of February morning that made Montana feel like a punishment. Clara was already up when she heard the main house door open. She had not slept well. The bunkhouse stove had burned down around 2 in the morning, and she'd woken to cold so complete it felt like a presence in the room. And she had spent the early hours feeding the fire back up and sitting with her knees pulled to her chest and thinking through everything she knew and everything she didn't. By the time weak light started coming through the frozen shutter cracks, she had made some decisions. She was going to earn her keep here, or she was going to leave. Those were the only 2 options that left her any dignity. She was not going to be a problem that Caleb Mercer had to solve. She heard him cross the yard toward the barn, and she gave it 10 minutes, and then she followed. He was working when she came in, forking hay down from the loft for the 2 horses, moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done the same task so many times it required almost no thought. He heard her come in and looked down from the loft, and she could see him recalibrating. She had clearly not been expected this early. "I can help with the morning work," she said before he could say anything. "I know horses. I can muck stalls, I can feed, I can handle whatever you don't want to spend time on." He came down the loft ladder with the fork in one hand. "You don't need to do that." I know I don't need to. I'm choosing to. She held his gaze. I'm not going to sit in that bunkhouse all day while you work. That's not how I'm built. A long moment passed. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the platform, that direct, inventorying look. And then he handed her the fork. East stall needs cleaning, he said. Pitch goes in the pile outside the south door. All right. He went back up the loft. She went to the east stall. It was not glamorous work. It was cold, and it smelled, and the east stall had not been cleaned in a few days, and the horse, a big bay named, according to Lily's wagon ride information, Henderson, regarded her with deep skepticism. She talked to Henderson while she worked, quietly and without expectation, which was her standard approach to skeptical horses, and by the time she'd finished the stall, Henderson had softened enough to let her scratch behind his ear. Small victories. Caleb came down from the loft while she was finishing and watched her work for a moment without comment. Then he said, You've done this before. My uncle had horses when I was young. Where? Kentucky first, then Ohio. She didn't elaborate. She didn't say that the uncle had been her mother's brother, not her father's, and that staying with him had been one of the better stretches of her childhood and one of the shorter ones, because people in that county had opinions about her mother's people, and eventually those opinions had made the situation untenable. She didn't say any of that because it was first thing in the morning, and she'd just met this man, and some things you kept until you knew whether knowing them would be safe. Caleb nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. They worked through the rest of the morning chores in near silence, but it was a companionable silence. The kind that happens between two people who are both focused on the same practical problem and aren't wasting energy on performance. He showed her where the feed was stored and where the water barrel was and which fence line had been giving him trouble since the last freeze. She listened and remembered. She asked 2 questions, both practical, neither personal. By mid-morning, they were back inside the main house because Lily had appeared in the barn doorway in her coat and boots and announced that she was hungry and that it was past breakfast time and that someone needed to address this situation. Caleb's kitchen was exactly what she had expected, functional to the point of austerity and with clear evidence of someone who ate to survive rather than for any other reason. There was flour and salt pork and dried beans and some canned goods and a pot that had seen years of use and a cast iron pan that was, at least, well seasoned. Can I? Clara asked, gesturing at the kitchen generally. Caleb looked mildly uncomfortable, which she suspected was his version of feeling like a burden was being lifted. You don't have to. I know that too. He sat at the table. Lily climbed up beside him and watched Clara work with the focused attention of someone taking mental notes, which Clara suspected was exactly what she was doing. The biscuits came out imperfect. The oven ran hot on the left side and she didn't know that yet, so the left half of the batch was slightly overdone. But they were light enough and they were warm. And when she put them on the table with the salt pork and some of the preserved peaches from last night's supper, Lily took one and bit into it, and her expression changed in a way that was entirely involuntary. These are better than Papa's, she announced. Lily, Caleb said, I'm not being mean. I'm being honest. She looked at Clara. How do you make them not like rocks? Less handling of the dough, Clara said. Once it comes together, you stop. Most people work it too long trying to make it perfect, and that's what makes it dense. Lily absorbed this like someone filing it for future use. Caleb ate 2 biscuits without comment, which Clara took as a positive review. It was the most ordinary breakfast. And somehow that was the strangest part. How ordinary it was, sitting at this man's table in this house that wasn't hers, with this child who talked continuously and this man who talked barely at all, eating food that had come out slightly wrong on the left side. She hadn't had ordinary in a long time. She didn't let herself think about that too much. The trouble came, as Clara had known it would, from town. She had been at the ranch 4 days when Caleb came back from his weekly supply run with a jaw set tight and a manner about him that Lily read immediately as meaning she should find somewhere else to be. The girl evaporated toward the barn with admirable timing, and Caleb set his supplies on the kitchen table and stood there with his coat still on. Ward's been talking, he said. Clara kept her hands on the bread dough she was working. Saying what? That I'm harboring a woman of questionable character. He said the phrase the way you say something that tastes bad. That the respectable people of Blackthorn Ridge have a concern for the moral standing of the valley, and that my choices reflect on everyone who does business with me. And people are listening. Some are. He was quiet for a moment. Holt Davies, he runs the feed store, told me this morning he might not be able to extend my credit through spring. He's been extending it for 3 years. Clara finally looked up from the dough. I'll leave. I didn't say that. I know what I heard. What you heard, Caleb said, with a deliberateness that suggested he had thought this through on the ride back, was me telling you what happened, not telling you what I've decided about it. She looked at him. He had his arms crossed and his coat still on, and he looked, if she was being honest, like a man who was genuinely irritated. Not at her, but at the situation, which was a different thing and one she recognized. You can't afford to lose your credit line, she said. I can't afford a lot of things, he said. I may do. Caleb. She said his name for the first time, and he looked at her directly, which told her he noticed. I'm not a charity case. If my being here costs you, I go. That's just sense. It's not just, it's letting Ward run things, which is what he wants. He pulled his coat off and hung it by the door with more force than was necessary. I've been letting Ward run things in this valley for a long time because it was easier. He's had opinions about my family before. About Lily. He stopped. His mouth pressed into a line. Clara waited. Her mother was Crow, he said finally, in a voice that had gone quiet and flat. Half Crow. Ward made sure everyone in the county knew what that meant, in his opinion, when I married her. Made our lives smaller than they needed to be. He turned to look out of the window. She died, and he acted like that settled something, like the natural order had been restored. The kitchen was very still. I'm sorry, Clara said. And she meant it fully. Not the hollow social sorry, but the kind that acknowledges real weight. I'm not telling you that for sympathy, he said. I'm telling you because I want you to understand why I'm not interested in doing what Ward tells me to do this time either. Even when it costs you. It already cost me everything once, he said. A feed store credit line is not the thing I'm most afraid of losing. Clara stood there with flour on her hands and looked at this man who was talking to his window instead of to her because he wasn't good at this, and he knew he wasn't good at this, and he was doing it anyway, and she thought, there it is, the thing underneath the silence. The reason the ranch had the specific feeling it had, not cold, not unwelcoming, but held together by a man who had decided that if he just kept working hard enough, the grief would eventually have less room. I'll stay, she said. For now. He turned from the window. Something in his face settled, though it didn't exactly relax. For now, he repeated, like he understood exactly what that meant and was accepting it for what it was. The valley did not take the news quietly. Within a week, Clara had been the subject of 2 separate conversations that she wasn't supposed to hear. One at the general store when she'd gone in for thread, and a woman named Mrs. Aldrich had said, loudly enough to carry, that some people had no sense of appropriate behavior, and another outside the church when she'd waited in the wagon for Caleb and Lily to come out from the Sunday service that she hadn't attended because the look on the pastor's wife's face when they'd driven past had told her clearly that her presence would not simplify anything. She heard these things and she filed them away, and she did not react, because reacting was what people like Mrs. Aldrich wanted. It gave them confirmation of whatever they'd already decided, and Clara had been providing that confirmation her whole life, and had decided some years back to stop doing it. What she did instead was work. She reorganized Caleb's kitchen stores so nothing got wasted. She recaulked the bunkhouse window with tallow and paper because the cold coming through the gap had been keeping her up. She started keeping track of the ranch accounts, not because anyone asked her to, but because Caleb had a ledger that was a genuine mess. Not dishonest, just disorganized, with numbers entered in whatever order they occurred to him, and no running total and 3 different systems for recording expenses that had clearly evolved without plan. She spent 2 evenings straightening it out and left the cleaned ledger on the kitchen table without comment. The next morning she found a note on top of it, written in handwriting that was utilitarian rather than elegant. Thank you. The feed numbers were wrong by $14. I'll adjust with Davies. Short, practical, no flourish. Exactly what she'd expected. She smiled at it despite herself. Lily noticed everything, as Lily always did. Papa left you a note, she observed at breakfast, in a tone of enormous casual unconcern that was clearly performing enormous casual unconcern. He did. He doesn't usually write notes. I see.
He wrote me a note once when I was sick and he had to go to town. It said, "Soup on the stove, back by dark. Don't go near the east fence." Lily picked at her biscuit. I thought that was pretty good for him. Clara looked at the girl across the table, the dark eyes, the focused expression, the constant movement of thought behind the face. She was 8. She'd learned by now. 8 years old and had already lost her mother and been on the receiving end of enough cruelty from this town to have developed what Clara recognized as a sophisticated defense system. The child said everything directly and without social filtering, because if you said the true thing first, there was nothing for the cruel thing to attach itself to. It was a strategy Clara recognized because she had developed it herself, years later and less completely. "Lily," she said. Are you happy here?" "Generally." Lily looked up, surprised by the directness. Then she considered the question with genuine seriousness, which was the only way she seemed to approach things. "I'm okay here," she said finally. "The ranch is good. Papa is good. The school—" She made a face that communicated volumes without words. "The other children. Some of them are fine. Most of them say things because they heard their parents say things first." She shrugged, a small, tight movement. "I know that's what it is. It doesn't make it feel better, but it makes it make more sense." Clara thought about being 8 years old and knowing that, about having to know that at 8. "You're pretty wise for someone your age," she said. "Papa says I'm an old soul." Lily pulled apart her biscuit. "I don't know what that means exactly. I think it means I pay attention." "That's exactly what it means." The first real confrontation happened on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week. Caleb had ridden out to check the fence line on the north pasture. There were tracks suggesting the coyote problem had expanded, and he wanted to assess before deciding how to handle it. Clara was in the main house working on the mending pile that had accumulated to a point of genuine crisis. There was a shirt of Caleb's with 3 separate tiers that had all been ignored past the point of easy repair, when she heard a wagon come up the road. She looked out the window and saw 2 men she didn't recognize, and one she did. Elias Ward sat in the front of the wagon with his hat squared and his coat buttoned and the specific posture of a man who has decided he is conducting official business. The 2 men with him were larger, not his size, but hired large, the kind of large that was there to make points without speaking. Clara set down the shirt. She thought for approximately 5 seconds about waiting for Caleb. Then she thought about what 5 seconds of deliberation actually meant, which was that she already knew what she was going to do, and she went to the door. She opened it before Ward could knock. He was on the porch step, his hand raised, and there was a split second where his composure genuinely cracked. He hadn't expected the door to open, hadn't expected to be met rather than to arrive. And in that split second, Clara saw exactly what was under the performance. Not power, just a man who had never in his life been made to feel small and was therefore terrified of it. "Mr. Ward," she said. He recovered quickly. He was practiced at it. "Miss Whitaker." He said her name the way you say a word you've decided means something different than its dictionary definition. "I came to see Mercer. He's not here." "Then I'll wait." "You can wait in town." His jaw tightened. Behind him, the 2 large men shifted their weight. "I don't think you understand the nature of this visit." "I understand it perfectly." She kept her voice even. "You've come to make a point. The point is that you have influence in this valley, and you want to use it to make Mr. Mercer's life uncomfortable until he makes a decision that you want him to make. I understand that's what's happening. I'm telling you that Mr. Mercer isn't here, and I'm asking you to leave." Ward's face did something complicated. "You're a bold woman for someone in your position." "My position," Clara said, "is standing in a doorway of a house where I was invited. What's yours?" A silence. One of the large men coughed. Ward leaned in slightly and lowered his voice, which somehow made it worse. "This isn't going to end the way you're hoping. Mercer is a practical man. When the pressure gets heavy enough, he'll see sense." "Maybe," Clara said. "That'll be his choice to make." "And yours, to leave before it becomes unpleasant." "I've had unpleasant before," she said. "I'm still here." She held the door at an angle that was not a slam but was an unmistakable signal, and after a moment that stretched past comfortable, Ward turned and went back to his wagon. He said something to one of the large men that she couldn't hear, and the man glanced back at her, and then they drove away. Clara closed the door.
She stood with her back against it in the empty house and let out a long, slow breath that she'd been holding for longer than she'd realized. Her hands were not quite steady. She pressed them flat against the door behind her and waited for them to settle. She was not afraid of Elias Ward exactly, but she understood what men like him were capable of when they felt defied. And she was not naive about what it meant that she had just defied him. She had done it because she hadn't been able to stop herself, because there was something in her that refused, absolutely refused, to perform submission for people who had not earned the right to require it. It had cost her things before that refusal. She knew it might cost her something here. She pushed off the door and went back to the shirt with the 3 tiers and picked up the needle. Her hands had steadied by the time Caleb came back that evening. She told him about the visit plainly, without drama, the way she'd report any practical information. She told him what Ward had said and what she'd said back, and then she stopped and waited. Caleb stood by the door listening with his hat in his hands and his face doing something she couldn't quite read. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You told him to leave," he said. "I did." "From my property?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "I'll apologize if that was overstepping." Another pause. "It wasn't," he said. "Caleb." She said it the way she had before, when she wanted him to actually hear her rather than hear around her. "He's going to come back, and he's not going to be reasonable about it. You should know that going in." "I know, Ward." "Then you know what I'm saying." He looked at his hat. He turned it in his hands twice, a habit she'd started to recognize. "Did he threaten you directly?" "Indirectly. He was careful about it." Caleb's face tightened in a particular way. "All right," he said. "All right what?" "All right, I know." He hung his hat by the door. "I've been thinking about this since Davies pulled my credit, about how far Ward's willing to go." He looked at her. "He wants you gone. But it's more than that. It's been more than that for a while. He's wanted me manageable for a long time, and he's been looking for the right lever. And I'm the lever." "You're what he thinks is the lever." He said it without softening. "The question is whether he's right." She looked at him steadily. "Is he?" Caleb looked back at her. Outside, the wind was picking up again, working at the eaves, looking for the places the house wasn't sealed. "No," he said. He said it simply, without building up to it, the way he said most things that mattered, as if working up to them was a form of dishonesty. She believed him. Lily came down sick on a Wednesday. It started as the kind of sick that children get in winter, a cough, a slight fever, the glazed expression of someone operating at reduced capacity. Clara recognized it and was not initially alarmed. She made broth and kept the fire up and insisted Lily stay in bed, which Lily resisted with every available argument before eventually surrendering to pure exhaustion. By Thursday, the fever was higher. By Thursday night, it was high enough that Clara was tracking it by the hour, sitting beside the girl's bed with a damp cloth and watching her closely and doing the calculations in her head. How much time had passed, how high the fever had gone, whether it was leveling or still climbing. Caleb stood in the doorway of Lily's room, looking like a man who had used up all his composure and was operating now on pure will. "The doctor," he said. "Dr. Haynes is in Milburn," Clara said. "How far?" "Day and a half in good conditions, 2 in this snow." "How's the snow right now?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Clara looked at Lily, the flushed cheeks, the rapid, shallow breathing, the way her body had gone still in the too deliberate way of a body working very hard. She thought about what she knew. She thought about the 2 years she'd spent at the bedside of Eleanor Marsh in Columbus, an elderly woman who'd had a physician son and a household full of medical texts, and who had believed firmly that a woman who worked in her home should understand the basics of fever management and not simply panic every time a temperature climbed. Clara had read those texts. She had been a thorough reader out of boredom as much as anything, and boredom had turned out to have practical value. "I need willow bark," she said. "Do you have any?" Caleb stared at her. "It reduces fever. It's an old remedy, but it works. Dried bark, steeped in hot water. Do you have any in the house?" He moved. She heard him going through the supplies, the sounds of things being moved and shifted. He came back 3 minutes later with a small cloth bag that had been pushed to the back of a high shelf. "Sarah used to keep things," he said. His wife. He said it without looking at Clara. "I never cleared it." Clara took the bag and opened it and found willow bark, dried chamomile, some other things she recognized and some she didn't. "This is good," she said. "This is what I need." She worked through the night. She didn't think of it that way at the time. She just worked, moving from task to task in the way that hard situations required, not getting ahead of herself. The tea, steeped and cooled to the right temperature. The damp cloth rotated on a reliable schedule. Lily's position adjusted when the girl's breathing changed. The fire kept exactly high enough to maintain warmth without overheating the room. Caleb stayed. He didn't hover. He had the good sense to stay out of the way when she was working. But he didn't leave either. He sat in the wooden chair in the corner of Lily's room with his elbows on his knees, and he stayed. Around 2 in the morning, when Lily had a difficult hour and the fever spiked hard enough that Clara's whole body went cold with something that wasn't temperature, she looked up from the bed and found Caleb watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude, exactly. Too raw for that. "She's going to get through this," Clara said. She said it firmly, not because she was certain. She wasn't certain, and she was not the kind of person who made promises about things she couldn't guarantee, but because she needed him to hold together and she needed to give him something to hold on to. He nodded once. He didn't ask her to promise because she thought he understood she wasn't the kind of person who promised things she couldn't guarantee. They sat in the small room with the sick child between them and waited. At dawn on Friday, Lily's fever broke. It didn't break dramatically. Fevers didn't, usually. It just began, gradually, to recede. Clara tracked it for 2 more hours before she let herself believe it, and then she sat back in her chair and put her hands in her lap and looked at the ceiling and let out a breath that she hadn't known she'd been holding since approximately Thursday morning. Lily opened her eyes around 8 o'clock. She looked at Clara first, then at her father in the corner chair, then back at Clara. Her voice was hoarse and thin. "You were here all night," she said. "I was." "Both of you?" "Both of us," Clara said. Lily closed her eyes again. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that Clara thought she'd gone back to sleep. And then she said, in the small, unguarded voice of someone still too tired to manage their words carefully, "Can you stay and be my mother?" The room went absolutely still. Clara felt the question like something physical. She looked at this girl, this 8-year-old with her mother's absence and her father's stubbornness, and her own particular intelligence that saw things straighter than almost anyone Clara had met, and she felt the floor of something shift under her. She didn't answer right away. She couldn't. Not because she didn't know what she felt, but because she knew that what she felt was not the same as what was true, and she was too honest to make a promise out of an emotion in a moment like this. But she reached out and she took Lily's hand and she held it, and Lily, eyes still closed, held back. Caleb, in the corner, said nothing. Clara didn't look at him, but she was aware of him, aware of the silence he was keeping, the particular quality of it, the way it had changed from the silence of a man holding himself together to something else that she didn't have a word for yet. Outside, the snow was still coming down. The world outside the windows was completely white and completely without mercy, and inside this small room there were 3 people who had arrived at something none of them had planned for or known how to want. And whatever it was already more complicated than shelter. Lily slept for most of that Friday and all of Saturday, and Clara stayed close. Not hovering, she had things to do, and doing them kept her from thinking too hard about the question Lily had asked in that half-conscious early morning hour, the one that had settled into the room like smoke and hadn't fully cleared. She made broth, and kept the fire, and changed the cloth on Lily's forehead when it needed changing, and in between those things she mended the rest of the pile and reorganized the pantry shelves, and did not think about, "Can you stay and be my mother?" any more than was unavoidable, which was still quite a lot. Caleb was harder to read than usual those 2 days. He worked. He always worked. But he came in to check on Lily more than he normally would have, and twice Clara caught him standing in the doorway of his daughter's room just watching her sleep with an expression that was too private to look at directly. She gave him those moments and moved away and didn't comment, because some things a person needed to feel without an audience. On Sunday morning, Lily sat up on her own and announced she wanted eggs. "You want eggs," Caleb repeated from the doorway. "Scrambled, and one of Clara's biscuits if there are any left." She looked at Clara. "Are there any left?" "There aren't," Clara said, "but I can make more." "You don't have to." "I know," Clara said, for what felt like the 100th time in 3 weeks and went to the kitchen. She heard Caleb behind her, his boots on the floorboards, and then he was in the kitchen doorway, and she was already measuring flour, and he said, "She's going to be all right." "She is," Clara agreed, "because of what you did." Clara set down the flour. She turned to look at him because this felt like a conversation that required looking at someone rather than talking to the counter. "I did what I knew how to do, that's all. That's not nothing." "No," she said, "but it's also not—" She stopped, trying to find the honest way to say it. "It's not a debt, is what I mean. You don't owe me anything for it. She needed help, and I knew how to help. That's the whole thing." Caleb looked at her steadily. He had a way of looking at her that she'd gotten more used to, but hadn't entirely gotten used to. Direct in a way that was neither invasive nor evasive, just present. "Clara," he said. "Hmm? Stop deciding what I'm trying to say before I've said it." She blinked. "I wasn't working up to a debt," he said. "I was trying to tell you that I'm—" He stopped. He looked at the window, then back at her. "Grateful. That's the whole thing." A silence. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. "All right," Clara said. "All right," he said, and went back out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with the flour in her hands and felt something she didn't entirely have a name for. Not warmth, exactly, or not only warmth. Something more like recognition. The specific feeling of being seen by someone who didn't make a production of seeing you. She started on the biscuits. Lily recovered with the speed that children recovered from things that would have taken adults twice as long, and by Tuesday she was at the kitchen table doing her school lessons and conducting a running commentary on the unfairness of long division and periodically asking Clara's opinion on mathematical philosophy, which was her way of looking for an ally. "It's not unfair," Clara said from across the table where she was working on the accounts. "It's just hard. Hard things can also be unfair." "True. But long division is just hard." Lily regarded her with mild betrayal. "I thought you'd be on my side." "I'm on the side of you understanding long division." Clara looked up. "Work through the next 3 problems, and then I'll check them, and if you've got them right, we'll stop for today." Lily looked at the problems. She looked at Clara. She picked up her pencil. This was how the days had begun to run. Not by design, not by anyone sitting down and deciding what the arrangement was, but by the accumulation of mornings and tasks, and the particular way that Lily had started treating Clara as a fixed point in her orbit. The girl came to Clara with questions, with problems, with the daily small complaints that children bring to the adults they trust, and Clara answered them the way she answered most things, honestly, without condescension, and without pretending things were simpler than they were. It was not without awkwardness. There were moments when Lily grabbed her hand in the yard, when the girl fell asleep against Clara's arm on the wagon seat during a supply run, when Caleb came in from work and found them at the table together and stopped in the doorway in a way that had a particular quality Clara couldn't name, when the shape of the thing they were all building became briefly visible, and the visibility of it made Clara's chest do something complicated. She was not going to let herself get ahead of it. She had been in places before that felt like they might become home, and she had learned that feeling and certainty were not the same thing, but she was also not going to pretend she didn't feel it. Ward made his second move on the last Wednesday of February. Clara heard about it from Caleb when he came back from town with a face she'd learned to read. The jaw set slightly too far forward, the hands not quite still. He told her plainly, the way he always told her things. Holt Davies had formally revoked the credit line, not extended through spring as he'd previously said, but revoked entirely. And Davies hadn't been alone in it. 3 other merchants, the grain supplier, the man who sold seed, and the ironmonger who'd been repairing Caleb's equipment on account, had all, within the same week, sent word that they could no longer extend credit to the Mercer ranch. The timing was not coincidental. Ward had coordinated it, which required a level of deliberate effort that told Clara this had moved past principle into something personal for him. "Can you operate through spring without the credit?" she asked. "Not easily." He sat down at the table and put both hands flat on it, looking at them. "I have some cash reserves. Not enough. The cattle need to come through in good shape this season for any of it to work out." "What do you need?" He looked up. "What? What do you need that you can't buy right now, specifically?" He told her. Feed for the cattle through to the thaw, which was 6 to 8 weeks depending on the weather. Supplies for a fence repair on the south pasture that had been deteriorating since October. 2 specific parts for the pump mechanism in the barn that had been failing intermittently and would eventually fail entirely. Clara listened to all of it. Then she said, "I have $40. Caleb stared at her. "I've been putting a little back since I got here," she said, "from what you've been paying me for the housework." He'd started paying her, not a wage exactly, but a small regular amount that he'd begun leaving on the kitchen table without discussion 3 weeks in, which was his way of making clear the arrangement had terms. "And I have some savings I'd kept from before. It's not a lot, but it covers the feed through April if you buy it in bulk from the supplier in Milburn rather than Davies. Clara, I'm not taking your money. I'm not offering it as a gift. I'm offering it as a stake." She met his eyes. "I've been eating your food and sleeping in your bunkhouse and working on your ranch for 6 weeks. That makes me part of whatever this is. If this place goes under because Ward pulled the credit, I go under with it, so I have an interest in making sure it doesn't." He didn't answer right away. He was thinking. She could see it. And he was not a man who thought quickly when something mattered to him. "That's your whole reserve," he said. "I know what it is. If the cattle don't come through this season, then we're both in trouble and we'll figure it out." She said "we're" without thinking about it, and then heard herself say it and left it there because taking it back would be worse than saying it. Caleb heard it too. She saw him hear it. "All right," he said after a moment. "All right," she said. It was the same exchange they'd had before, those same 2 words, and somehow it meant more each time. As if all right were a private language they'd developed without planning to, a shorthand for things that were too large to say directly. March came in with a thaw that lasted 4 days and then reversed savagely, a late cold snap that hit harder than anything February had produced, dropping temperatures so fast that the meltwater in the yard froze where it stood, and the cattle in the north pasture had to be moved in a hurry to the south paddock, which was closer to the barn and better protected. Clara and Caleb spent an entire day in that work, and by the end of it, her hands were blocks, and her voice was gone from shouting over the wind, and she had not said a single graceful thing the entire day. She'd said, "Get the damn gate, and that one's breaking left, and Caleb, the rope now." And none of it was graceful, but all of it was exactly what was needed. They ate supper that night, too tired to talk, and then sat by the stove in a silence that was not uncomfortable. And Lily, who had been kept inside for the day by mutual decree, sat between them and read her book without requiring conversation, which Clara thought showed unusual social wisdom for an 8-year-old. When Lily went to bed, the quiet continued, but it changed quality. It was a different silence with just the 2 of them, had been for a while, and both of them knew it, and neither of them addressed it. "Ward's going to escalate," Clara said, because the work of the day had made her direct, and she was too tired to approach things sideways. "I know. He didn't get what he wanted with the credit. That means he'll find another angle." Caleb poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. He didn't pour one for her without asking. "You want some?" "Please." He poured. He sat back down. He said, "He's going to try to use the land." Clara looked at him. "I've got a grazing rights dispute that's been sitting with the county recorder for 2 years. Small piece of pasture on the east boundary. It was my grandfather's claim originally. The documentation is old, and the county recorder at the time was Ward's uncle." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Ward has been sitting on it, not pressing, not withdrawing, just leaving it there as a thing he can pick up whenever he decides to use it. And he's going to pick it up now. That's my guess. Can you fight it?" "Depends on the documentation. The original claim papers are—" He stopped. "I don't know where they are. That's the honest answer. Sarah handled the paperwork. I never had to think about it, because Ward never moved on it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Then we find the papers. If they exist." "They exist," she said. "Where would Sarah have kept things?" He was quiet for a long moment, longer than the question required, and she understood why. Going through Sarah's things was not a practical matter only, it was a personal one, and she'd just asked him to do it casually over coffee. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was—" "No." He cut her off, not harshly. "You're right. I've been leaving her things exactly where they were because it was easier." He looked at the cup. "The desk in the front room. She kept everything in the desk." Clara said nothing. She just waited. "I'll look tomorrow," he said. "I can help if you want, or I can leave you to it, whichever is better." He thought about it genuinely. "Help," he said finally. "It'll go faster." She nodded. They drank their coffee in the quiet house, while outside the cold pressed against every window and every gap it could find, and Clara thought about what it meant, helping a man go through his dead wife's desk to find papers that might save a ranch, and could not locate a simple feeling about it anywhere. There was too much mixed in together. She didn't try to sort it, she just drank the coffee. The desk yielded what they needed, though not without a cost. It was a small desk, pine, nothing elaborate, pushed against the wall in the front room that functioned as a sitting room and office both. The drawers were organized the way someone organized things when they expected to be around to use them. Practical, labeled in small handwriting, each category in its own section. Household accounts, correspondence, ranch documents. The handwriting was different from Caleb's, rounder, with more care taken over the letters. And seeing it clearly meant something to Caleb, because he slowed down when the first drawer came open and sat very still for a moment before he started going through it. Clara worked the right side of the desk. He worked the left. She found household receipts and seed catalogs and a recipe written on a folded piece of paper that Caleb looked at for a long time before folding it back up and setting it aside. She found letters, which she did not read and pass to him. She found a small notebook that turned out to be Clara Mercer's accounting records for the ranch's first 3 years. Neat columns and running totals and margin notes in that careful round hand. Caleb opened the notebook and closed it again. He set it with the letters. "Here," Clara said. He looked over. She had found it in the bottom right drawer under a collection of horse medicine receipts. A manila envelope, sealed, with the words East Boundary Claim. Original written on the front in ink that had dried brown. Caleb took it from her hand slowly. He opened it and pulled out 4 documents. Old, the paper gone tan at the edges, the handwriting a different era's formal cursive. He spread them on the desk between them, and they both leaned in to read. The first was the original homestead claim. The second was a survey record. The third was a transfer document, the claim passing from his grandfather to his father and from his father to Caleb, with witnesses named and dates recorded. The fourth was something Clara recognized before Caleb did, because she'd spent enough time in enough legal offices in Ohio watching things get handled and mishandled. It was a county registration confirmation, stamped and dated, signed by the recorder. Not Ward's uncle, but the recorder who'd come after him. Dated 4 years ago. "Caleb," she said, "I see it. This was registered after the old recorder left." She tapped the stamp. "This signature. This is official county documentation. Ward can't contest a registered claim without going to court. And going to court means making everything public, which means the original homestead documentation goes on record, which means he can't quietly bury it." Caleb was looking at the document with an expression that was working through something. "He's been waiting for me to give up and sell. If I give him anything to push against, he has to come at it legally or not at all." "And legal means transparent. Ward doesn't like transparent." "No," Clara agreed, "he doesn't." Caleb sat back. He ran a hand across his face, a gesture she'd seen before when he was processing something larger than the immediate practical question. Then he looked at the papers and then at her. "She filed this," he said, 4 years ago. I didn't know she'd done it." Clara understood what he meant. Clara Mercer had looked at the situation, the unresolved claim, the old documentation, the threat that Ward represented, and she had quietly, without telling anyone, gone to the county recorder's office and made sure the paperwork was airtight. She had done it the way Clara suspected she did most things, without announcement, with competence, thinking ahead. "She was protecting you," Clara said. "She always was," Caleb said, and the way he said it was not sentimental but something simpler and heavier, just true, with all the weight of true things that arrived too late to thank the person for. Clara gathered the documents carefully and stacked them. She would make copies, she had a good hand and the materials to do it, and they would keep the originals somewhere safer than an unlocked desk drawer. She did not say any of this yet. She just stacked the papers and let him have the moment. Ward came again on a Thursday in the second week of March, but this time he didn't come to the ranch. He called a meeting. It was the kind of thing Ward did when he wanted the weight of community behind him. He sent word to the influential men of the valley, framed it as a concern for the common good of Blackthorn Ridge, and by the time men like Holt Davies and the pastor and the man who ran the assay office arrived, they had already decided they were there to address a problem rather than to hear one person's argument against another person's. Caleb came home from that meeting with his hat in both hands, turning it. He stood at the door and Clara looked at him and knew before he spoke that it had been bad. He circulated a petition, Caleb said, to the county commissioner, claiming the Mercer Ranch is operating as... He stopped. His jaw worked. He used the term disreputable establishment. He implied, without saying it directly because he's careful, that you're here in a capacity that isn't appropriate. The silence that followed was very particular. Clara heard what Caleb wasn't saying, that Ward had taken her presence and made it into something it wasn't, something shameful, and had put that in writing and gotten men to sign it. How many signatures? She asked. 14. Did Davies sign? He did. She nodded slowly. She felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite despair, but something more specific. The precise particular feeling of having done nothing wrong and being accused anyway, which was a feeling she had a long and exhaustive history with, and which had not gotten any easier to feel just because it was familiar. What does the petition ask the commissioner to do? She asked. Investigate the operation of the ranch, and... He stopped again. And review whether the homestead claim is in compliance with county standards of residency, given changes in the household. Clara looked at him sharply. He's trying to tie the two things together. Yes. He wants the commissioner to open the land question at the same time as the character question, so that the one muddies the other. That's what I think. She stood very still. This was more sophisticated than she'd expected, and she found she was angry at herself for not expecting it. She had known Ward was capable of this kind of thinking, and she had allowed herself to get a little comfortable. The registration document, she said. I was thinking the same thing. We need to get it in front of the commissioner before Ward does. If he sees our documentation first and sees it's clean and properly registered, Ward's petition becomes a nuisance rather than an opening. The commissioner's office is in Helena, Caleb said. 2 days' ride. Can you go? He was quiet. I don't want to leave you and Lily here alone while Ward is... We'll be fine, Clara said. Clara. Caleb. She met his eyes. I stood in this doorway and told Elias Ward to leave twice already. I can do it a third time. That's not what worries me. Then what does? He was quiet for a long moment, turning the hat. If I go to Helena and it takes 3 days and something happens while I'm gone... He stopped. I've already lost one person because I wasn't here. The room was very still. Clara understood what he was carrying, had understood it for a while, in the way you understand things about people when you've spent time watching them live. The guilt of being absent, even when the absence couldn't have changed anything, was the kind of thing that didn't argue with logic and didn't respond to reason. It just sat. That's not the same thing, she said carefully. I know that. Sarah didn't die because you weren't here. I know that too. He looked at her. Knowing it doesn't move it. No, she agreed. It doesn't. They stood in that for a moment. The truth of it, the way grief operated outside the jurisdiction of understanding. I'll go to Helena, she said. He stared at her. I can make the trip. I have the documents. I know what they mean and how to present them. And I'm not known to the commissioner, which means he'll look at the papers rather than the history. She held his gaze. You stay with Lily. I go. That is not, it's not what you expected me to say, she cut in. I know, but tell me why it's wrong. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the hat in his hands. The roads, he said finally, are passable. The thaw held the main route open. You'd be traveling alone. I've traveled alone before. Not in Montana in March. No, she said. Not in Montana in March. But I've done things I hadn't done before and managed them. Another silence. He was doing the calculation. She could see it, running through the actual practical objections rather than the instinctive ones, which was the right thing to do and which told her again that whatever else he was fair. Mrs. Aldrich will use it against you, he said finally. If you ride alone to Helena, she'll... Mrs. Aldrich has already decided everything she thinks about me, Clara said. I've been here 6 weeks. There's nothing I can do that makes her think better of me. So the question of what she thinks is not useful information. A long pause. Something shifted in his face. The documents are in the envelope, he said. The registration confirmation is the one on top. That's the one you lead with. I know. The man's name is Commissioner Aldous Pryor. He's a formal man. He responds better to plain presentation than to argument. Understood. There's a boarding house on the north end of Helena's Main Street, run by a woman named Tessie Ford. She runs a clean house, and she won't— He stopped. She won't give you trouble. Tell her you're on Mercer Ranch business. Clara looked at him for a moment, at this man who had just handed her a mission that he'd needed to do himself, who had stood in his own kitchen and done the harder thing of letting her go instead of following the simpler instinct to protect by containing. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said gruffly. Just come back. He said it without looking at her, directed at the hat in his hands, and the straightforwardness of it. Just come back, not come back safely, or come back with good news, or come back if it goes well. Just come back. Did something to Clara's chest that she was not going to examine while she was standing in this kitchen about to plan a 2-day ride. I'll leave in the morning, she said. He nodded, then after a moment, I'll have the wagon ready at first light. I don't need the wagon. I know you don't need the wagon, he said. Take it anyway. She left him in his kitchen with his coffee and his hat and went to prepare for tomorrow, and she did not let herself think about how the house would feel when she left it, how the specific temperature of it, the particular quality of the light in the evenings, the sound of Lily at the table and Caleb at the door, had become in 6 weeks something she had not been looking for and could not now imagine being without. She had spent a long time traveling toward places that turned out not to be home. She was not going to name this one prematurely, but she packed the documents with more care than they strictly required because they were not just papers anymore. They were the thing standing between this place and the man who wanted to take it apart, and she was going to carry them to Helena and put them in front of Commissioner Aldous Pryor, and she was going to do it right. Lily came to find her in the bunkhouse that night, which had become a less surprising occurrence over the past weeks. She had her book and her lantern, and she stood in the doorway looking at Clara packing the saddlebag with the specific expression she wore when she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. You're going to Helena, she said. I am. To help with the land papers. Yes. Lily came in and sat on the other cot. She held the book in her lap and didn't open it. Are you coming back? Clara looked up from the bag. Yes? You're sure? Lily. She stopped packing and looked at the girl directly. I'm coming back. This is a 2-day trip. I'll be back by the weekend. Lily nodded. She picked at the cover of her book. People leave, she said, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for hard things. I know that's just what happens, but they don't always come back. The room was quiet except for the fire. Clara came and sat beside her on the cot, not hovering, not reaching for her, just sitting beside her the way you sit beside someone when the correct answer is presence rather than words. I know, she said, and I can't promise you that nothing will ever go wrong because that's not honest and you'd know it wasn't honest. She looked at the girl. What I can tell you is that I'm not leaving because I want to. I'm leaving because it's the right thing to do for this ranch and for you and your father. And I'll do it right, and I'll come back. That's the whole truth. Lily looked at her for a long moment with those 2 old eyes that saw things clearly. Then she nodded, a single resolved nod, and opened her book. You can read while I pack if you want, Clara said. I know I can, Lily said, and began reading aloud about ships and storms and the particular stubborn resilience of people who refuse to sink. Clara packed and listened and let the girl's voice fill the room, and outside the Montana night was enormous and cold and full of distances, and in the morning she was going to ride into it. She was not afraid. She was something more complicated than afraid. She was committed, which was a different thing entirely, and heavier and harder to put down once you'd picked it up. She was not putting it down. She left before the sun was fully up. Caleb had the wagon ready as he'd promised. Horse hitched, a blanket folded on the seat, a wrapped bundle that turned out to be bread and salt pork for the road. He didn't make a speech about it. He handed her the reins and told her the first water stop was at the Grange Creek crossing, about 4 hours out, and that the road forked 2 miles past that, and she wanted the left fork, not the right. The right looks better maintained, he said. It isn't. It washes out past the second rise. Left fork, she said. Understood. Lily was standing on the porch in her coat, her hair not yet braided for the day, watching. Clara looked at her and the girl raised one hand. Not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement, the specific gesture of someone who had said everything they needed to say the night before and was now just marking the moment. Clara lifted her hand back. She drove out of the yard without looking back, because looking back was not going to help anything, and because the road ahead required her full attention, and because there was a particular discipline involved in leaving a place you'd started to think of as yours. You had to commit to the leaving or the road pulled wrong under you the whole way. The morning was clear and bitter, the sky that particular pale blue that Montana produced in early spring, when the cold was genuine but the light was beginning to mean something again. She drove through it steadily. The horse, Caleb's second animal, a rangy roan he called Pate, who had opinions about pace but was ultimately cooperative, finding his rhythm on the frozen road. She went over the documents in her head as she drove. She had read them enough times to know them cold, and she had spent part of the previous evening writing out a clear summary of each one, what it established, what its legal weight was, what question it answered. Commissioner Pryor was a formal man, Caleb had said. That meant organized, which meant she needed to present things in a logical sequence rather than simply handing over a stack of papers and hoping for the best. She had a plan. She was going to execute it. The Grange Creek crossing came up exactly where Caleb said it would, and she watered the horse and ate some bread standing in the thin March sunshine and thought about Ward. She thought about the specific architecture of what he'd done. The coordinated credit pull, the petition, the land claim held in reserve like a card he'd been keeping since before she arrived. She had dealt with men like Ward before, though not usually men with quite this much infrastructure. The thing about them was that they were not stupid. Ward was not stupid. He was calculating and patient, and he had built 20 years of influence in this valley. Brick by brick. And the reason he'd been able to do it was that most people found it easier to go along than to push back. What he had not accounted for, what she suspected he never fully accounted for, because it was the blind spot that men like him reliably had, was the specific stubbornness of people who had already lost everything once and therefore had a different relationship to risk. She had nothing left to lose except what she'd found in the past 6 weeks. That made her dangerous in a way Ward hadn't anticipated. She got back in the wagon, found the left fork without difficulty, and drove on. Helena was larger than she'd expected and noisier. A territorial capital with aspirations, streets wide enough for 2 wagons passing, and a main street that had actual brick buildings mixed in among the wood-front stores. She found Tessie Ford's boarding house on the north end without much trouble. A 2-story white frame house with a sign in the window, and a woman on the porch who turned out to be Tessie herself. 60s, compact, with the manner of someone who had run a business in a frontier town, long enough to have categorized approximately every type of person who would ever come through her door. She looked Clara over when Clara said she was on Mercer Ranch business, and whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. Mercer, she repeated. Caleb Mercer's ranch? Yes. How's that man doing? She said it without the upswing of a question, more like she was updating a file in her head. Well enough, Clara said. Busy. He's always busy. Tessie held the door open. Rooms upstairs, supper's at 6. Commissioner Pryor's office opens at 8 in the morning. You'll want to be there at 8, not 8:15. He's punctual, and he notices when other people aren't. Thank you, Clara said. Don't thank me, I charge for the room. But she said it with the dryness of someone who had made that joke many times and still found it professionally useful. Clara slept better than she'd expected, in a narrow bed in a room that smelled of pine soap and old wood. And she was outside Commissioner Pryor's office at 7:55 the next morning with the documents in a clean folder and her coat brushed and her hair pinned properly. The office was in a stone building 2 blocks off the main street, and Aldous Pryor was, as advertised, punctual. He arrived at exactly 8 o'clock, unlocked the door himself, and looked at Clara waiting on the step with the particular look of a man who processed unexpected things by taking a moment before responding. Commissioner Pryor, she said, my name is Clara Whitaker. I'm here on behalf of the Mercer Ranch regarding the East Boundary Homestead claim. Come in, he said after a moment. His office was exactly as she'd imagined, orderly, functional, the desk clear except for the current work, bookshelves with volumes that had actually been read. He sat across from her and she presented the documents in the sequence she'd planned. Original claim first, survey second, transfer chain third, and then the registration confirmation last, sliding it across the desk and watching him read it. He was quiet for a long time. "This was registered 4 years ago," he said. "It was. Under your predecessor, Recorder Mills." "I know who Mills was." He looked at the stamp. "This is in order." "I believe it is," Clara said. "I'm here because we understand a petition has been submitted to your office regarding the Mercer Ranch's compliance with residency standards. We want to make sure the land documentation is on record with you directly before that petition is reviewed." Pryor looked at her over the top of the papers. He had the measuring look of a bureaucrat who had seen enough maneuvering to recognize it when it arrived wearing a different hat. "Who submitted the petition?" "Elias Ward of Blackthorn Ridge." A pause. The kind of pause that meant something. "I've received Ward's petition," he said. "It arrived yesterday." Clara kept her face steady. So Ward had moved faster than they'd anticipated, or he'd known she was coming, which was possible if anyone in Blackthorn Ridge had mentioned the wagon leaving the Mercer Ranch at first light yesterday morning. Either way, it meant the ground had shifted slightly and she needed to adjust. "Then I'm glad I came today rather than tomorrow," she said. "The petition raises concerns about the character of the ranch's operation," Pryor said. He said it carefully, not unkindly. "It's a separate matter from the land claim." "It is," Clara agreed, "except that it's been submitted simultaneously with a verbal challenge to the claim's validity, which suggests the intent is for each to support the other rather than for either to stand on its own merits." Pryor looked at her for a long moment. "You've dealt with legal matters before." "I've dealt with situations where documentation mattered," she said. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm someone who read the papers carefully." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. He looked back down at the registration confirmation. "The claim is registered and valid. That's not in dispute as far as this office is concerned." He tapped the paper. "As for the petition, I'll tell you plainly that a petition of community concern requires a formal response, which means an investigation of some kind. That's standard process. I can't simply set it aside." "I understand that," Clara said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking that when the investigation occurs, the land documentation is reviewed separately and on its own terms, rather than being colored by the petition's framing. That is how it would be handled in any case." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." Another measured look. Then he pulled a form from his desk drawer. "I'll need to log this as a formal submission. Your name, your relation to the ranch, and a statement that these are the original documents." She gave him everything he asked for, signed where he indicated, and left his office 40 minutes after she'd entered it. She stood on the street outside and let out a long breath. It wasn't over. Pryor had been clear that Ward's petition required a process, and process meant time, and time meant Ward had room to continue making Caleb's life difficult in the valley. But the land documentation was now formally on record in the commissioner's office, logged and dated, and that meant Ward's attempt to use the land claim as a lever had just gotten significantly harder to operate. It was not a victory. It was a position, and a position was what you needed to fight from. She was back in the wagon and on the road before noon. The return trip took longer than the trip out. Pata developed an opinion about the left fork on the return journey and expressed it by slowing to a pace that required persistent conversation, and by the time she reached the Grange Creek crossing, the light was already going amber, and she made the calculation that pushing through in the dark was riskier than stopping. She camped at the crossing with the horse tied and the wagon blanket pulled around her and the remains of the bread and salt pork for supper, and she sat in the cold under a sky that had gone brilliant with stars, the way Montana skies went. Not a few stars, but an unreasonable number of them, the whole overwhelming architecture of the thing. And she thought about the ranch. She thought about Lily at the table with her long division and her running commentary. She thought about the bunkhouse stove and the way the flue stuck on the first try and released on the third. She thought about Caleb at the barn in the early morning working in silence that wasn't empty. She thought about supper in the kitchen with the three of them and the specific texture of evenings that had become routine. Lily reading aloud, Caleb with his coffee, the fire doing its work. She thought about what Caleb had said the morning she left. Just come back. 2 words. But they were the kind of 2 words that meant more than 2 words. She pulled the blanket tighter and watched the stars, and did not let herself get too far into any of it, because she was alone at a creek crossing in March, and sentiment was not practical company. But she noticed that the thing she was most looking forward to, more than her own bed, more than a hot meal, more than the resolution of any part of the ward situation, was the specific moment of driving back into that yard and seeing the main house windows lit. She noticed that, and she let herself notice it, and then she went to sleep. She drove in the next afternoon around 3 o'clock. Lily saw her from the barn before she'd fully cleared the rise and came across the yard at a run. Not graceful, just fast, arms pumping, coat flying open. And Clara had barely pulled the wagon to a stop before the girl was at the side of it, slightly out of breath, looking up with an expression that was trying hard to be composed and not quite managing it. "You're back," Lily said. "I said I would be." "I know." The girl grabbed the wagon rail. "How did it go? Did you see the commissioner? Did he look at the papers? What did he say? Is Ward going to—" "One question at a time," Clara said, climbing down. "Which one do you want to answer first?" "The one about the commissioner." Clara looped the reins over the rail. "It went well enough. The papers are registered with his office now. The land claim is solid." Lily absorbed this. But there's a petition that still requires a process. It's not finished." "Is it going to be all right?" Clara looked at her honestly. "I think so. I can't promise you everything, but I think so." Lily looked at her for another second and then nodded. The same resolved single nod she'd used before, the one that meant she had accepted the information and was moving on. "Papa's in the barn," she said. "He's been checking on the cattle every 2 hours since yesterday. He says it's because of the cold snap, but I think it's because he needed something to do." "Go tell him I'm back," Claire said. "And then help me with the horse." Lily was already running. Caleb came out of the barn about 30 seconds later, not running, but walking faster than his usual pace. And when he came around the wagon and saw her, his face did the thing that faces do when they've been holding a particular expression in reserve and finally release it. He stopped a few feet away. He looked her over in the inventory way, checking, not admiring, making sure she was whole. "Roads were fine," she said, preempting the question. "I wasn't going to ask about the roads." "I know you weren't." She met his eyes. "I'm fine. The trip went as well as it could. I'll tell you everything over supper." He nodded. Then after a moment, "You stopped at the crossing." "The light was gone. It wasn't worth the risk." That was the right call. He said it simply, without any overtone of surprise that she'd made it, and that simplicity was its own thing. The absence of the assumption that she'd need to be told. She told him everything over supper, methodically, in sequence. What Pryor had said, what the documents established, what Ward's petition required in terms of process, and what she thought the position was now. Caleb listened without interrupting, which was his way, and Lily listened with her chin in her hand, tracking everything. When Clara finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He said the petition requires an investigation." "He did. That's standard process. He can't set it aside." "What does an investigation look like?" "At minimum, someone from the commissioner's office comes out to the ranch, asks questions, looks at the operation." She held his gaze. "What they find is a working cattle ranch with clean accounts and a man who has a legitimate homestead claim with proper registration. That's what's here." And the character question, the petition's framing, is harder to address formally, she said honestly, but harder is not the same as impossible. The petition makes claims. Claims require evidence. Ward has 14 signatures and a lot of opinion, but opinion isn't evidence, and Pryor seemed like a man who understood the difference. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. He did that when he was thinking through something to its end rather than stopping at the surface. "He's going to escalate again," Caleb said, "before the investigation gets here. He'll try to make things worse locally so that whoever Pryor sends arrives hearing a particular story." "Yes," Clara said. "I think that's right." "Then we need people in this valley who'll tell a different story." Clara looked at him. This was new. Caleb had been operating on a strategy of resistance, of holding firm against Ward's pressure, but he'd been doing it defensively. What he was describing now was something else. "You're thinking about going to people directly," she said. "I'm thinking about the people in this valley who have their own reasons to be tired of Ward," he said, "who've gone along with him because it was easier, but who might not if someone made the case differently." He looked at the table. "Davies pulled my credit line. But Davies has also been charged 3 times what the Billings supply house charges for grain, and he knows it. And he knows Ward is the reason the Billings house can't get a foothold here because Ward controls the freight contract. Clara was quiet, thinking. There are others, Caleb said. The Norris family on the South Valley. Ward bought their grazing rights cheap 10 years ago when they were in trouble, and they've resented it since. Tom Vesper at the assay office signed the petition, but his wife didn't, and she's the one who runs things. He looked at Clara. I know this valley. I've been keeping to myself. You've been keeping your head down, she said. I've been afraid, he said flatly. The way he said things that were true and uncomfortable, without softening them. I had Lily to think about. I didn't want to make things worse for her by making enemies. Ward made enemies of you whether you did anything or not. I know that now. Clara thought about the 14 names on that petition. She thought about 14 people who had signed their names to a piece of paper that said things about a woman they didn't know and a ranch they'd never had cause to question. Some of them had signed because Ward had leverage over them. Some had signed because it was easier than not signing. And some, probably only a few, had signed because they genuinely believed it. The last group was the hardest. The first 2 groups were possible. All right, she said. Let's think about who we talked to and in what order. Lily, who had been quiet for the past 10 minutes, looked up from her plate. I have a thought, she said. They both looked at her. Mrs. Vesper comes to the school sometimes to help with reading lessons, Lily said. She's always been nice to me. She stopped Mrs. Aldrich from saying something once, out front of the school. She just stepped in between them and started talking about something else. Clara looked at Caleb. He looked at Clara. Mrs. Vesper, Caleb said. Mrs. Vesper, Clara agreed. Ward's next move came before they were ready for it, which was the nature of Ward's moves. He didn't wait for convenient timing. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3 men rode onto the Mercer property and told Caleb that Elias Ward was formally notifying him of an intent to contest the east boundary grazing rights in county court, and that Caleb should expect a summons within the fortnight. Caleb received this information standing in the yard with his arms crossed and his face settled into the expression that Clara had come to think of as his working face, present, controlled, not giving anything away. Tell Mr. Ward I received the notification, he said. The men left. Caleb came inside and stood at the kitchen counter and said nothing for a long moment. He got to someone in the commissioner's office, Clara said. It wasn't a question. Has to be. Pryor said the land claim was in order. For Ward to move to a court contest this fast, he either had this planned before you went to Helena, or someone told him what Pryor said, and he decided to escalate before the investigation gives us any official standing. A court contest means everything goes on record, Clara said, publicly. It also costs money. He turned to look at her. Legal representation in Helena, filing fees, time away from the ranch during the hearings. She heard what he wasn't saying. How much in reserve? Not enough for a protracted court case. She sat down. She thought about the $40 she'd put in, the feed purchased, the season ahead. She thought about the documents in the commissioner's office. Solid, yes. Clean, yes. But only as useful as the process that was supposed to review them, and processes could be slowed by men with money and patience. Ward has done this before, she said. The court threat. Has he followed through on it? Caleb thought. Twice that I know of. The Harrigan family, 8 years ago. They settled and sold inside of 3 months. And the second time? Norris, 10 years ago. The grazing rights he bought cheap. Norris couldn't afford the fight. He paused. Norris has never forgiven himself for it. Clara looked at him. Then Norris is where we start. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. It was the silence of 2 people who had just looked at the size of what they were facing and had not looked away from it. Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. He was tired. She could see it, the real bone-deep kind that wasn't about sleep. He had been managing this ranch alone for 3 years, carrying his grief and his daughter and the slow financial pressure that Ward had been applying long before Clara arrived. She had shown up and handed him new complications along with new help, and she was aware that the ledger on that was not entirely clear. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. If it would be easier, if the situation would be simpler without me here, I need you to tell me that honestly. He looked at her steadily. Is that what you want me to say? I want you to say what's true. What's true, he said, is that Ward was going to do this eventually with or without you. I've been the wrong kind of person in his valley since before I married Sarah. You're not the cause of this. That's not exactly what I asked. No, he said. It's not. He was quiet for a moment. What I want is for you to stay. That's what's true. He said it simply, without dressing it up, which was the only way he ever said things that mattered. What I want and what's fair to ask of you are different questions. I'm not going anywhere, Clara said. That's also true. He held her gaze for a long moment, long enough that the kitchen went very quiet around them, the only sound the fire and the wind outside, and Lily, somewhere in the back of the house, turning the pages of her book. Then we talked to Norris, he said, and Mrs. Vesper. And whoever else in this valley has been waiting for someone to start pushing back. He said it with a quietness that was not defeated. The opposite of defeated, actually. The specific quietness of a man who had made a decision that he intended to keep. Clara recognized it because she had felt it herself. That morning on the platform with the snow coming down and the envelope at her feet, when she had decided she was not going to leave even though every sensible calculation said she should. Sometimes a decision felt like giving up, and sometimes it felt like planting your feet. This one felt like the second thing. They went to Norris on a Thursday, the two of them together, leaving Lily with instructions and a list of afternoon chores that Lily received with the professional resignation of someone who understood that being trusted with chores was a form of respect but still had opinions about it. Robert Norris was a big man gone gray and slightly stooped in the way of people who'd done physical labor for 40 years, and he met them at his door with the wariness of someone who'd learned that visitors usually wanted something. He looked at Caleb for a long moment, and then at Clara, and then he stepped back and let them in. His wife brought coffee without being asked. She sat in the corner of the room and listened without speaking, and her listening had a quality of attention that told Clara she would have opinions afterward and that Norris would hear them. Caleb told him plainly the court contest, the petition, the credit line. He didn't ask for anything directly at first. He just put the situation on the table and let it sit there. Norris listened with his elbows on his knees. When Caleb finished, he was quiet for a long time. He's going to do to you what he did to me, Norris said. That's what I think, Caleb said. I couldn't stop it. Norris's voice carried something flat and old. I didn't have anything to fight with. We do, Clara said. Both men looked at her. The registration is clean. The documentation is at the commissioner's office. What we don't have is people in this valley willing to say what they know. She looked at Norris directly. You know what Ward did 10 years ago. You know what it cost you. If you were willing to put that in a statement, a written account of what happened, what was said, what the terms were, it becomes part of a record. It's not nothing. Norris looked at his hands. Wouldn't change what he can do in court. No, Clara said. But it changes what he costs to fight. Ward wins because people believe no one will push back. If people push back, he has to spend to fight it, and he has to do it publicly, and public is what he doesn't want. She paused. He's a man who operates in the dark. We're trying to turn a light on. Mrs. Norris spoke from her corner for the first time. Write the statement, Robert. Norris looked at his wife. Write it, she said. You've been carrying it for 10 years. Put it on paper and give it somewhere to go. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Norris looked at Caleb and said, Who else are you talking to? Vesper, Caleb said. Tom Vesper's wife, at least. Norris nodded slowly. He looked like a man picking something up that he'd put down a long time ago and wasn't sure he still had the strength for. Emmett Briggs might listen, he said. Ward's been running him short on the freight contract for 2 seasons. He knows it, but he's been afraid to say anything. Can you talk to Briggs? Caleb asked. Norris thought about it. Maybe, he said. I can try. It wasn't a commitment. It was a maybe, which was more than they'd walked in with. Walking out of the Norris place into the cold afternoon, Clara felt the weight of what they were building. Not a legal strategy exactly, not a formal coalition, just a gathering of people who had individually concluded that a particular man had taken too much, and who had not previously understood that they were not the only one who thought so. It was not a plan. It was the beginning of one. And beginnings were fragile things. They could collapse at the first real pressure, at the first moment when having a maybe felt too thin to hold. But it was something. Caleb drove them back with his eyes on the road and his hands steady on the reins, and after a while Clara said, That was good.
It was a start, he said. Yes. The road home ran through the long, flat stretch of valley with the mountains in the west going pink in the late light, and the horse kept his pace, and they didn't talk much, but the silence between them had the quality it had been developing for weeks, comfortable in the specific way that silences become comfortable between people who have stopped needing to fill them. She was thinking about Ward, about Norris, about the court summons that would arrive within the fortnight. She was thinking about what the next steps needed to be and in what order and what was going to go wrong that she hadn't anticipated, because something always went wrong that you hadn't anticipated. And underneath all of that, below the strategy and the worry and the planning, was the simple, steady fact of the man sitting beside her on the wagon seat, his hands on the reins, his shoulder near enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold, and the specific rightness of being headed back to the same place. It was not the life she had planned when she answered that advertisement. It was not the life she had planned for any point in the past 10 years. It was better than planned. It was arrived at, through train platforms and frozen bunkhouses and nights with sick children and trips to Helena and conversations with men who had been waiting a long time to say what they knew. She hadn't been looking for it. It had found her anyway, the way certain things did. Not by appearing in a form you recognized, but by building itself slowly out of the available materials until one day you looked at what was there and understood that it had been becoming home for longer than you knew. The court summons arrived on a Monday, 11 days after the men had ridden onto the Mercer property with Ward's notification. Caleb brought it in from the road and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony, and Clara read it while the coffee heated on the stove. The language was formal and dense and designed to sound more conclusive than it was. A filing date 3 weeks out, a hearing in the county court in Helena, the East Boundary grazing rights listed as the subject of the contest. Ward's name was on the filing as plaintiff. Caleb's name was on it as respondent. 3 weeks, Caleb said. 3 weeks is enough time, Clara said, though she was doing the calculation as she said it, and the calculation was tight. They had Norris's written statement, which he had delivered 2 days after their visit. 4 pages in careful handwriting that laid out every detail of what Ward had done 10 years ago. The coercion, the deliberately depressed price, the threats that had never been put in writing but had been understood perfectly. They had a conversation with Eleanor Vesper that had gone better than expected. The woman had listened, asked precise questions, and said at the end that Tom would not sign any counterstatement because Tom had his own fears, and she respected that, but that she herself would speak to anyone who asked her directly about what she knew of Ward's methods. And they had Emmett Briggs, who Norris had brought to the ranch on a Sunday afternoon, a lean, sun-creased man who had sat across the table from Clara and Caleb and described, in the flat, careful voice of someone who had been storing something for a long time, exactly how Ward had manipulated the freight contracts in the valley to keep competition out and his own suppliers dependent. 3 statements. 3 people willing to put their names to what they knew. It was not an army, but it was not nothing. I need to write to a lawyer in Helena, Clara said. Today. Caleb looked at her. We talked about the cost. I know what we talked about. She kept her voice level. But going into that court without representation is walking in blind. Ward will have a lawyer. If we don't, we're not arguing on the same ground. She looked at the summons. There's a man named Garrett Foss who has an office on the 2nd Street in Helena. Tessie Ford mentioned him when I was there. She said he takes cases on delayed payment when he believes in them. She mentioned him specifically? She said he was the man she'd call if she ever needed someone to fight something she couldn't afford to lose. Clara looked up. That seemed like a useful recommendation. Caleb was quiet for a moment, doing his own calculation. Write the letter, he said. She wrote it that afternoon. Plain, detailed, no excess language. She laid out the documentation, the petition, the court filing, the statements they had, and what she understood about the legal position. She described the property and its registration and the history of Ward's actions in the valley. She said they could not pay full fees immediately, but could guarantee payment from the season's cattle proceeds if the case resolved favorably. She signed it with her name and Caleb's name both, folded it, and gave it to the mail rider who came through the valley road on Tuesday mornings. Then she did what she had learned to do in situations that had moving parts she couldn't control. She kept working. Set. Garrett Foss wrote back in 8 days. His letter was shorter than hers. 3 paragraphs. Handwritten, direct.
He had reviewed what she'd described. He believed the registration documentation was solid. He was willing to take the case on the terms she'd proposed. He would need the original documents and the witness statements delivered to his office no later than 4 days before the hearing date. Caleb read the letter twice. He set it down on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Clara and said simply, "Good." It was the whole of his reaction. Good. 2 letters that carried the weight of genuine relief without performing it. She understood him well enough by now to know that was not understatement. It was just how he was built. He did not expand to fill the space available. He occupied only what he needed, and the words he used meant exactly what they said, no more and no less. Good, she agreed. The week before the hearing was the hardest, not because of the legal preparation, which moved forward in the methodical way that things move forward when you have a plan and you execute it. Documents copied, statements organized, the originals packed with the same care she'd packed them for Helena the first time. Not because of Ward, who had gone uncharacteristically quiet, which was in some ways more unsettling than his activity. The hardest part was the ranch itself, and the way the ordinary life of it continued running underneath everything else. The cattle needed moving to the north pasture as the march ground began to soften. The pump mechanism that Caleb had been nursing through the winter finally failed completely on a Wednesday and needed 2 days of work to get the replacement parts fitted, during which they were hauling water by bucket. Lily had a school examination that she was anxious about in the specific way she was anxious about things. Not visibly nervous, just more quiet than usual, working through her arithmetic in the evenings with a focused intensity that indicated genuine worry underneath the composure. Clara helped her study on the night before the examination, sitting across the table from her while Caleb read in the other chair, working through the problems methodically and without false encouragement. When Lily got something wrong, Clara said so, and they worked through why it was wrong and did 3 similar problems until the concept was solid. When Lily got something right, Clara said that too, without making more of it than it was. At the end of the session, Lily looked at her and said, "You'd be a good teacher." "I'm a decent explainer," Clara said. "That's different." "What's the difference?" "A teacher does it every day for many different children with many different problems. I'm explaining things I happen to know to one specific person I happen to know well. That's easier." Lily considered this. "I think you underestimate yourself," she said, in the tone of someone delivering a considered opinion rather than a compliment. "Possibly," Clara said. "Go to bed." Lily went to bed. Caleb looked up from his book and caught Clara's eye across the room, and the corner of his mouth moved in what was, for him, a significant expression of amusement. "She's not wrong," he said. "Don't encourage her," Clara said, and went to make sure the fire was banked for the night. And if she was smiling when she did it, there was no one positioned to see it. They rode to Helena for the hearing on a Wednesday morning, the 3 of them, Lily included, because there had been a brief discussion about whether she should stay, and Lily had ended the discussion by appearing at the wagon in her good coat at 5 in the morning without being asked, which Caleb and Clara had both recognized as a statement that did not require further debate. Foss met them at his office the evening before the hearing. He was younger than Clara had expected, mid-30s, with the slightly rumpled quality of a man who thought faster than he organized himself. And he had clearly read everything she'd sent him with genuine attention, because his questions were specific and his understanding of the documentation was exact. He spread the papers on his desk and walked them through the argument. The registration confirmation was the center of it, clean, stamped, signed, unambiguous. The original homestead chain was the foundation. Norris's statement and Briggs's statement were not directly relevant to the land claim, but established a pattern of Ward's conduct in the valley that could be introduced to contextualize the court filing as part of a systematic campaign rather than a legitimate legal concern. "Ward's lawyer will argue the registration has procedural irregularities," Foss said. "He'll claim the transfer documentation from your grandfather's era doesn't meet current standards." "Does it?" Caleb asked. "No," Foss said, "but neither does anyone else's documentation from that era, and the county can't retroactively apply current standards to homestead claims without invalidating half the property in Montana Territory. That's the argument. The court will not want to open that door." Clara had understood this, had understood it when she first read the documents in the desk. But hearing Foss say it with the confidence of someone who knew the legal terrain made it more concrete. "The petition," she said. Ward's character petition against the ranch's operation. Separate matter, Foss said. Different process. The commissioner's investigation is still pending. That hasn't moved because Pryor is a deliberate man and he runs a proper process. What I can tell you is that the petition, as filed, makes claims it cannot support with evidence. Opinion and signatures are not evidence. Pryor knows that. He looked at Clara directly. The petition is Ward trying to create a climate. The court case is him trying to create a legal fact. We're here to prevent the legal fact. Pryor's process will handle the climate in time. It was the most honest legal assessment she'd received, delivered without reassurance that wasn't earned. All right, she said. All right, Caleb said. They were getting very practiced at that word. The hearing was in the morning, in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and lamp oil and the specific staleness of a room where serious things were decided by people who weren't always equipped for the seriousness. Ward was already there when they arrived. He was sitting at the plaintiff's table in a good suit, with a lawyer beside him, an older man, carefully dressed, with the practiced stillness of someone who had been in many courtrooms and had stopped being impressed by any of them. Ward looked at Caleb when they came in, and the look was the one Clara had seen on the train platform. The look through rather than at, the look that said he had already decided what the outcome was. Lily sat in the gallery between Clara and a woman Clara didn't know who turned out to be Tessie Ford, who had appeared without announcement and settled into the bench with the air of someone who had business being there and didn't require explanation. Clara looked at her and Tessie gave her a small nod that communicated more than a longer greeting would have. The judge was a compact man of about 60 named Whitfield, who had the manner of someone who had long ago decided that his time was the scarcest resource in any room he occupied. He called the hearing to order with minimal ceremony and indicated that he had reviewed the filed documentation in advance and had questions. Ward's lawyer presented first. His argument was exactly what Foss had predicted. Procedural irregularities in the transfer documents, standards of registration that had evolved since the original claim, the suggestion that the east boundary line had never been formally surveyed under current county requirements. It was smoothly delivered and it was, Clara could see, designed to sound more devastating than it was, the kind of argument that worked on people who weren't sure what the standards actually were. Foss was not one of those people. He stood up with the registration confirmation and the survey record and walked through each point methodically and without theater. He cited the statute that governed grandfathered homestead claims. He noted that the registration had been completed and stamped by a sitting county recorder 4 years prior, which constituted official recognition of the claim's validity under the applicable standards of that time. He said plainly that retroactive application of evolving survey standards to pre-existing registered claims was not a legal mechanism available to the court without legislative authority it did not have. Judge Whitfield asked 3 questions. Foss answered all 3 without hesitation. Ward's lawyer made a second argument. Foss addressed it. Ward's lawyer made a third. Foss addressed that too. The whole thing took 2 hours, which was both shorter and longer than Clara had expected. Shorter because Foss was efficient, longer because the weight of what was being decided made every minute feel substantial. Judge Whitfield recessed for 30 minutes. When he came back, he said without preamble that the east boundary grazing claim of the Mercer Ranch was a validly registered homestead claim under applicable territorial statute, and that the plaintiff's contest was without sufficient legal basis to proceed. He dismissed the filing. He made no comment on the broader situation because that was not his jurisdiction, and he moved immediately to the next case on his docket. It was over, not triumphantly over. There was no dramatic moment, no visible reckoning for Ward, nothing that looked like justice arriving with any particular ceremony. Ward and his lawyer left the courtroom through the side door without speaking, and the room rearranged itself for the next matter, and that was all. Clara sat in the gallery and felt the thing that she had learned over the years was the actual texture of a good outcome. Not euphoria, just the specific quiet of a weightlifting. The removal of something that had been pressing down. Lily, beside her, said nothing for a moment. Then she took Clara's hand and held it, and Clara held back, and Tessie Ford on the other side said quietly, and to no one in particular, "Good," in exactly the same tone Caleb used the word, which made Clara think that some things were simply the correct response, and different people arrived at them independently. Caleb was standing when Clara looked over at him. His face was doing the thing it did when something mattered, and he was keeping the outside of it still. He met her eyes across the courtroom, and the look between them was not a celebration. It was simpler than that, and more durable. They had done this together. That was the whole of it. Ward did not disappear from the valley. Men like Ward did not disappear. They recalculated. In the weeks after the hearing, Commissioner Pryor's investigator came to the Mercer Ranch, a quiet man named Hollis who spent 2 days asking careful questions and looking at the accounts and the property and the operation, and who spoke to Clara directly and at length about the nature of her presence on the ranch and her work there. She answered everything plainly and without embellishment. She showed him the accounts she kept, the ledger work, the records of the ranch's operations over the past 3 months. Hollis also, it turned out, spoke to Eleanor Vesper, and to Robert Norris, and to Emmett Briggs. 3 weeks after his visit, Pryor wrote to Caleb. The investigation had found no basis for the claims in Ward's petition. The petition was closed without action. When Caleb read that letter, he sat at the kitchen table for a long moment. Then he put it down. He looked at Clara. "It's over," he said. "The petition is over?" she said. "Ward is still Ward." "Yes," he said, "but he's Ward without his tools." He was quiet for a moment. "Davies came to me last week, quietly, wanted to reinstate the credit line. Did you accept?" "I told him I'd think about it." He said it without satisfaction, just as information. "Briggs has been talking to a supplier in Billings. If the freight contract opens up, it changes things for half the valley." Clara thought about the 14 names on the petition, about how many of them had signed because Ward had leverage, and how many had signed because they thought it was safe to, and how many were now recalculating. She thought about the specific mathematics of power in small places, how it depended on the belief that it was total, and how that belief could shift when someone pushed back and the sky did not fall. It didn't make those 14 people good. It didn't make the cruelty that had happened on the train platform undone. It didn't make any of the things she'd experienced in her life smaller or easier, but it changed what was possible here. And what was possible here had become, without her planning it, the thing she cared most about. Caleb asked her on an evening in late April, when the snow was finally and genuinely gone and the valley had begun to do the thing it did in spring, green coming up through the brown like a decision being made slowly and then all at once. They were on the porch after supper. Lily was inside, audibly engaged with her book. The evening was the specific kind that Montana produced in that season, cool enough to need a coat, light enough to make you forget for a moment that winter had been so long and so mean. He had been quiet for a while, which was not unusual, but the quality of the quiet was different, the way his quiets had varieties she'd learned to read. "Clara," he said. He was looking at the valley, not at her. He had his hands on the porch rail, and he was looking at the land the way he looked at things when he was thinking them through to the end. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to let me get through it before you say anything." She turned to look at him. "All right. You came here because you had nowhere else to go." He said it plainly, not cruelly, just acknowledging the truth of it. "I gave you shelter because my daughter asked me to, and because leaving you on that platform was something I couldn't do." He paused. "Neither of those is a reason for what I'm about to ask. I want you to know I know that." Clara waited. "You fixed my accounts," he said. "You saved my daughter's life with what you knew. You went to Helena alone and came back with what we needed. You talked to Norris and Vesper and sat across from Ward's lawyer and didn't flinch." He turned to look at her now. "None of those things are the reason either. I'm listing them because I want you to understand I see them, that I know what you've done and who you are." "Caleb," I said, "let me finish." She closed her mouth. "I'm not a man who is easy to live with," he said. "I know that. I work too much and I talk too little, and I loved someone before and lost her, and I don't—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't move fast at things that matter to me. I move careful because I know what it costs when things go wrong." "I know that about you," she said quietly. "I know you do." He looked at her steadily. "I want to marry you. Not because it's practical, though it is. Not because it would make things simpler with the valley, though it might. Because I want a future with you. Because this ranch feels different since you came, and I don't want to go back to what it was before." He paused one more moment. Because Lily asked you to stay and be her mother, and I've been thinking about what the right answer to that question is. And the right answer is that it should be your choice, and it should be a real choice, and not something that just happened because circumstances arranged it. He held her gaze. So I'm asking. The evening was very still. Clara looked at this man, this imperfect, quiet, hardworking, grief-carrying man who had stopped on a train platform because his daughter asked him to, and who had not, in all the months since, once treated her as something less than exactly what she was, who had taken her opinion seriously and her money seriously and her anger seriously and her competence seriously, which was not as common as it should have been, and which she did not take for granted. She thought about the train platform. She thought about the envelope in the snow. She thought about this bunkhouse stove and the frozen flue and Lily reading about ships in the lamplight and the ledger on the kitchen table and the trip to Helena alone in the cold and the courtroom and the letter from Pryor and the evening coffee and the particular silence that had developed between them that was the most comfortable silence she had ever known. She thought about what she had been looking for when she answered that advertisement. She had been looking for a door that was open. She had found, instead, a window in a different wall entirely, and she had climbed through it in the middle of winter without knowing what was on the other side. What was on the other side was this. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment as if making sure he'd heard correctly. Then something in his face released. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way a thing that has been held under tension for a long time finally rests. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes," she said again, because it was worth saying more than once. From inside the house, Lily's voice. "I'm not eavesdropping." A pause. "What did she say?" Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. "She said yes," Caleb called back. The sound that came from inside the house was not words. It was simply a sound, high and involuntary, the specific noise of an 8-year-old who had been hoping for something for a long time and had just been told she could have it. Clara laughed. She hadn't meant to, and it was not a graceful laugh, and it didn't matter at all. The wedding was small, on a Saturday in May. Tessie Ford came from Helena because she said she had an interest in how things turned out. Robert Norris and his wife came because they wanted to, which was the only reason that counted. Emmett Briggs came and stood at the back and didn't say much and was there, which was its own statement. Eleanor Vesper came alone and sat in the front and held herself with the specific dignity of a woman who had made a decision she was at peace with. The pastor's wife did not come. Mrs. Aldrich did not come. Holt Davies did not come. Ward did not come, because Ward had not been invited, and he was not the kind of man to attend a thing he hadn't been invited to. The valley did not transform overnight. Small places did not work that way. There were people in Blackthorn Ridge who continued to have opinions, who continued to say things Clara was not meant to hear but sometimes did. There were afternoons that were harder than others, encounters in the general store that required more composure than she always felt like deploying. That was the truth of it. Anyone who tells you that the right outcome makes everything simple afterward is lying to you or lying to themselves. But the ranch was theirs. The land claim was registered and solid and no longer held hostage by a man who had been using it as a weapon. The accounts were clean and the credit was reinstated and the cattle came through the season in better shape than the previous year, which was partly good fortune and partly the result of moving them at the right time in March, when the cold snapped back. Lily started the new school year in September with a confidence she hadn't had in the previous one, not because the other children were different, some were, some weren't, but because the ground under her had changed, the way ground changes when you know that the place you come from has people in it who will stand up. She still grabbed Clara's hand when she needed to. She still read aloud in the evenings. She still had opinions about long division and delivered them with the full weight of her considerable conviction. She called Clara Mama for the first time on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October, in the middle of a conversation about something entirely unrelated. She was asking about the horses and she said, "Mama, do you think Henderson is getting old?" And then she heard herself and looked at Clara quickly, checking. Clara looked back at her. "I think Henderson has a few good years left," Clara said, "but we should keep an eye on his front left. He's been favoring it." Lily nodded, and the conversation continued, and neither of them made anything of the word because it didn't need to be made anything of. It was just true. And true things didn't always need ceremony. Well, there is something people want to believe about stories like this one, that they are about rescue. that a woman in trouble was found by a man who saved her, or that a man in grief was found by a woman who healed him, or that a child who needed a mother was given one by the universe arranging things kindly. That's not what this was. Clara Whitaker was not rescued. She was given a starting point and she built from it, using everything she had, which was more than most people in that valley had bothered to understand. Caleb Mercer was not healed. Grief does not heal. It becomes part of the structure of a person, and he carried his still, would carry it always, but it stopped being the only weight. Lily Ward, Lily Mercer now, was not saved by someone arriving. She was a child who already knew how to survive and who was given, finally, room to do more than survive. That is the actual thing. Not the story of a woman nobody wanted, but the story of a woman who refused to accept other people's accounting of her worth. Not the story of a man who chose someone the world rejected, but the story of a man who stopped letting his silence be mistaken for consent. The frontier was not kind. It was not designed to be kind. It was designed to test what you were made of, and what you were made of turned out to matter more than where you came from, or what you looked like, or whether the right people had decided you belonged. Clara understood something, in the years that followed, that she had been working toward her whole life without having the words for it. Belonging is not granted. It is not given by the consensus of people who do not know you. It is built, the way a ranch is built, one hard season at a time, with the right people beside you, by hands that refuse to stop working. The woman who arrived on a frozen platform in the winter of 1884, with a worn suitcase and an envelope in the snow and nowhere left to go, became something that no one in Blackthorn Ridge had thought to predict. She became the woman who stayed. Not because she had to, not because she ran out of options, but because she chose it, every day, the same way you choose anything worth having, with full knowledge of what it costs and the decision that it's worth it anyway. That is the only kind of belonging that lasts.